Deep in the Canadian forests of British Columbia, where cedars and pines tower over mossy slopes and rivers rush with cold water from the mountains, lived an elderly man named Arthur. He was over 60, his face covered with wrinkles like a map of his life, and his eyes shone with calm wisdom. Arthur was a widower who had once served as a forester, but now, in retirement, he spent his days alone, fishing and occasionally carving figures out of wood. His small hut stood by a lake surrounded by mountains, where he found solace in the sound of the wind and the lapping of the water. One autumn day, when the maple leaves were ablaze with crimson, Arthur went fishing at a distant stream that flowed a few kilometers from his home. The catch was good. Several trout were already lying in his old backpack, and the sun was setting, painting the sky in golden pink tone. Arthur usually returned along the familiar path, but this time, wanting to shorten the journey and get home before dark, he decided to go through a dense forest that the locals called Bear Corner. This place was considered wild, and even experienced hunters avoided it. Making his way through the ferns and stepping over fallen logs, Arthur enjoyed the silence, broken only by the singing of birds. But suddenly the silence was replaced by the heavy crunch of branches. Arthur froze. Right in front of him, a few meters away, a bear emerged from behind a huge boulder, massive, black with fur glistening in the setting sun. Her eyes, dark and deep, met his gaze. She was so close that Arthur could see the steam coming out of her nostrils and hear her low, almost threatening breath. Arthur's heart pounded, but he remembered the lessons of his youth, when the senior forester taught him how to behave when encountering a bear. He slowly raised his hands, trying to appear larger, and spoke in a calm, low voice. "Hey, big guy, I'm not a threat. Let's part ways peacefully." The bear rose on her hind legs, towering over him like a tower. Her height was terrifying, almost 2.5 meters. But instead of roaring or attacking, she suddenly lowered herself onto all 4 paws and made a strange sound. Not threatening, but plaintive, almost like a cry. Arthur lowered his hands and looked closely. The bear's side was covered with deep wounds, oozing blood, and her front paw was twisted unnaturally, as if broken. Her fur was matted, covered with dirt and thorns. She did not look aggressive. Rather, she looked exhausted and desperate. Arthur remembered how, that morning, standing on the bank of the stream, he had seen the bear with a small cub. They were playing on the other side, and the cub was happily jumping on the rocks. Now the cub was nowhere to be seen. Suspecting that the bear was seeking help, Arthur decided to trust his intuition. He cautiously stepped back, but the bear, limping, took a step toward him and whimpered again. Her eyes, full of pain, seemed to... "All right, girl, lead me," Arthur said quietly, feeling adrenaline mixed with compassion. The bear turned and slowly walked toward the river, looking back to make sure he was following her. They made their way through the forest, and Arthur noticed more and more signs of a struggle. Broken branches, bloodstains on the grass, deep scratches on tree trunks. He realized that the bear had probably encountered a predator, perhaps a cougar or another bear, while protecting her cub. A few minutes later, they came to a rushing stream, where the water roared down the rocks, and there, in the middle of the stream, Arthur saw a small bear cub. It was desperately clinging to a slippery boulder, with the water lashing at its sides, threatening to sweep it away at any moment. The mother bear stopped at the water's edge and whimpered again, looking at Arthur. He understood. She was trying to save her baby, but her wounds prevented her from reaching it. Time was running out. Arthur took off his backpack, took out the old fishing line he always carried with him, and tied one end tightly around his waist, and the other around the trunk of a sturdy pine tree. He took a deep breath, remembering the days of his youth, when he served in the Coast Guard and had rescued people from rough waters more than once. The cold penetrated to his bones, and the rocks under his feet were as slippery as ice. He struggled against the current, feeling the rope tighten, keeping him from falling. The bear cub, seeing the man approaching, panicked and tried to crawl away, but its claws slipped, and it fell into the water. Arthur, without hesitation, rushed forward. The rope stretched to its limit, but he managed to grab the bear cub by the scruff of its neck, pressing it to his chest. The cub was wet, trembling, and too weak to resist. The way back to shore was even harder. The current was pulling him back, and the cub, though small, weighed enough to make the task difficult. Arthur felt his strength melting away, but he kept fighting, remembering the face of his late wife Alice, who always told him, "You're stronger than you think." Finally, he made it to shore, breathing heavily. The mother bear, seeing her cub, rushed toward him, but immediately collapsed, unable to stand. Her wounds were too severe. Arthur carefully placed the cub next to her. The cub snuggled up to its mother, whimpering softly, and she licked its muzzle, as if thanking him for saving it. But Arthur knew that without immediate help, the mother bear would not survive. Fortunately, at that moment, the sound of an engine could be heard. A ranger vehicle emerged from behind the trees, followed by two tourists, who had noticed what was happening from a nearby trail. One of the rangers, a young woman named Clara, immediately assessed the situation. "Are you okay? What happened here?" she asked, looking at Arthur, who was wet and exhausted, and at the wounded bear. Arthur quickly explained what had happened. The rangers called for backup, and soon a team arrived with stretchers and medical equipment. They carefully bandaged the bear's wounds to stop the bleeding, and loaded her and her cub into the van. Arthur insisted on going with them to the Wildlife Rescue Center, located an hour away. There the bear was scheduled for surgery. Her paw was broken, and the wounds on her sides required stitches. The cub was placed in a warm cage with blankets, where he quickly fell asleep, exhausted but safe. Arthur spent several days at the center visiting the bears. He talked to the veterinarians, helped prepare food for the cub, and even carved a small wooden toy in the shape of a fish for him. The cub, whom the center's staff named Ori, quickly became attached to Arthur, and the bear, named Nova, looked at him gratefully when he brought her water. The veterinarians said that the cub's presence gave Nova the strength to fight for her life. After 2 weeks of intensive care, Nova began to get up, and her wounds began to heal. Ori, full of energy, was already playing in the enclosure, chasing a ball. The day of release arrived. Arthur, along with rangers and volunteers, took the bears to a protected area where there were no hunters or roads. The forest was dense, full of berry bushes and streams, the perfect place for bears. When the cage was opened, Nova cautiously stepped out, sniffing the air. Ori jumped out happily after her, but paused for a moment and looked at Arthur. There was something human in his little eyes, as if he were saying thank you. Then the cub turned and ran after his mother, disappearing into the green thicket. Arthur stood in the clearing, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. He knew he would never see Nova and Ori again, but a quiet joy settled in his heart. He had saved not just 2 bears, but a piece of the wild nature he loved so much. The rangers shook his hand, and Clara said, "Arthur, you're a hero. This story will live on for a long time." When he got home, Arthur carved a small figure of a bear with a cub out of cedar wood and placed it on the mantelpiece next to a photo of Alice. Every morning, looking at it, he remembered that day by the river and felt that his life was still full of meaning. This story spread through the local news, inspiring people to protect nature and help those in need. Arthur became a local legend, but the most important thing for him was knowing that somewhere in the forest, Nova and Ori were living freely, together as they should be. Friends, thank you for taking the time to read this story. If it touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to support us and learn more about wildlife and its wonders.